In his 1963 remarks at Amherst College, honoring the poet Robert Frost, President John F. Kennedy said, "If art is to nourish the roots of our culture, society must set the artist free to follow his vision wherever it takes him." While Kennedy was talking about the broader American culture, as a classical composer, in many ways, my artistic vision and its associated freedoms comes from exploring the very roots of my own cultural heritage, both American and African, that of my mother and father, respectfully. Like most Americans, my cultural roots are diverse. My African American mother has a heritage that is traced back to slavery. My Nigerian father has a direct African lineage that spans back many generations. It wasn't until early in my career as a professional composer that I decided to connect to my musical roots. This began with my penchant for the Negro spiritual and slave songs of 18th and 19th century America. Then several years later, my interest in the music of West Africa, specifically that of my father's tribe, the Ishan people in the southern region of Nigeria. I find the process of fusing my musical heritage with my classical training to be cyclical. My classical music education enables me to study and understand my musical heritage, and discovering my musical heritage enriches my classical compositions. In other words, because of my classical music education, specifically becoming proficient with its organized systems of analysis and training as a classical composer, I've been given the tools to discover musical gems unique to my heritage. At the same time, incorporating these elements in my music has strengthened my compositional craft by increasing meaning, purpose, as well as as well as growing in musicianship and creativity. One of the many appealing qualities of the discipline of music composition in the 20th and 21st century is, in fact, the attention to folk genres and non-Western art forms. As composers, we want to continue to push the limits of conventional musical elements such as tonality, tuning, rhythm, timbre, form, etc. Now, while I believe there's certainly room for progressive musical elements within Western musical conventions, to fully embrace this progressivism, the what's next in music composition, it makes the most sense to step outside the context and embrace folk genres and non-Western styles. Stated differently, and perhaps ironically, as we try to find the new, we have to sometimes seek unconventional, or what our ears perceive to be as unconventional, musical genres, many of which are much older than our European lineage of art music. I will give a few examples of this fusion before I go into some of my own experiences. Lou Harrison, the 20th century American composer, loved to embrace non-Western art forms, specifically that of Indonesia. An interesting example of this union is his Concerto for Piano and Javanese Gamelan. Even the title is a fascinating paradox. You have Concerto for Piano, which sounds like Mozart or Beethoven, and Javanese Gamelan. I can't even name a composer or person who plays that, but it's totally non-Western. To pull off this interesting work, Harrison asked the piano to be retuned to gamelan tunings, including the use of microtonality. Now, microtonality is just a fancy word for sounding out of tune. This next example is an appropriate transition to my personal motivation for folk genres and non-Western styles as a part of my own creative output. 20th and 21st century Mexican composer Arturo Marquez will often draw upon his cultural roots, composing many orchestral works based on Mexican dances, rhythms, melodies that use the same orchestral colors as many of the Romantic composers. One of his most popular works for orchestra is his Danzón No. 2, and as you will see, it's full of Mexican flavor. So as a 21st century composer, I too have sought ways to incorporate non-Western musical elements and folk genres. My motivation, however, wasn't merely to find the what's new in music. Rather, like Marquez, I imagine, it was one of the ways I wanted and knew how to connect to my heritage and genuine longing to know, feel, bond, grow in that which is already a part of me. And to go further, this was energized by my devotion to Christ and his church, recognizing that the gift of music is not limited to one era or one region of the world. So as a Christian, I could not help but explore. So let's start with the musical heritage of my mother. Being a Black American, her heritage can only really be traced back to slavery. We know the history. Africans were brought to this country hundreds of years ago as slaves, which lasted many generations. These African slaves, despite unimaginable challenges, formed one of the most beautiful, inspiring, and spirit-filled musical genres of today, the Negro spiritual, a musical tradition still alive in both secular and sacred arenas universally. And for example, spiritual didn't seem out of place in The Lion King, Disney's The Lion King, when Scar sang, "Nobody knows the trouble I've seen." Or on the sacred side, it just seems natural for all kids in all Christian churches to grow up singing the spiritual, "He's got the whole world in his hands." So in a way, it was that simple yet extraordinary fact that despite the tragedy of slavery, there was truly an inspired musical tradition that was born. I had to learn more, as it was naturally a part of my lineage as an African American, and as a musician, it needed to become more a part of my artistic pursuits. So with that hunger, I would spend years engaging the text of these slave songs. I would be drawn to how discerning and personal these messages were, how the text spoke hard truths of slavery humbly and in such a meaningful and even beautiful way. As a lover of poetry and language, it was fascinating how the text would often include double narratives that were coded messages that communicated plans for escape, or how the songs incorporated imagery that paralleled stories from Holy Scriptures. You know, like in Exodus, specifically the Lord's deliverance of the Israelites from slavery in Egypt, and the slaves, their own hopes of being delivered by the same God. They compared their struggles to the Israelites. Above all, these songs, though full of hope, told the story of an oppressed people. This perfect union between the powerful text and compelling melodies, addictive tunes that also have the power to touch souls, is what makes these stories so real to me. As a result of this discovery, a good part of my output as a composer is reimagining these slave songs in a variety of ways: orchestral, choral, symphonic band, art song. One example are my settings of spirituals for piano and voice. The works are operatic in style, use contemporary composition techniques, and to keep its integrity, I tried to preserve some of the original melodies and embrace the slave vernacular. With this set, I worked hard to compose a masterwork that can simultaneously have its place in the popular arena, the academy, and the church, with the purpose of reaching as many people as possible, despite different levels of musical experiences, cultural or educational backgrounds, both secular and sacred. This folk genre, with all of its multidimensional elements, had the power to do just that, adding depth and breadth to my works. And because of this care and passion for the musical tradition of my mother, I have grown as a composer. For example, sensitivity to melody. I am more aware of nuances of melody and contour and how it can effectively enhance text. What does it mean, for example, for a melody to rise or to fall? Or how to shape a phrase or form contrapuntal nuances as a vehicle for enhancing meaning. Then there's the attention to extra musical elements and its associations. This can be accomplished, for example, by incorporating harmony and rhythm that comes with specific connotations that can provide subtle meaning within a different context. Or, for example, direct quotations of pre-existing tunes, or more explicitly, evoking mood or character. An example of this is my spiritual, "O Freedom." So part of the text simply says, "O freedom, O freedom, O freedom over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free." In this setting, my goal was to evoke the idea of a former slave, remembering what it's like to work hard all day in the fields and vowing never to return. So, throughout the entire composition, no matter what happened melodically and harmonically, I composed a constant and consistent cluster of notes on beats 2 and 4 as a stark reminder of work. And before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave. So you have the idea, this work cadence, but that was juxtaposed with constant harmonies symbolizing the hope to come, even in death.
They'll be singing, they'll be shouting, there'll be glory, oh, freedom over me. And before I be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave, and be home with my Lord, and be free.
Another example is my reimagination of the spiritual Deep River. This simple song is said to be a coded guide for slaves to escape to freedom, and at the same time is a metaphor for their ultimate freedom, and that is with Christ in heaven. Musically, I try to evoke the range of meanings as well as the imagery of the river by composing an accompaniment that was multi-layered and fluid.
Oh, don't you want to go to that gospel feast, that promised land, where all is peace, deep river, Lord, I want to cross over into campground.
So that was my mother's musical heritage. Now to transition to my father's musical heritage. I must first note that as a Black American, I can't help but feel fortunate that I have a direct line to my African heritage. As I stated before, one of the tragedies of slavery is the fact that that line has been severed for so many Black Americans. I'm first-generation American on my father's side. He's Nigerian and immigrated to the United States over 3 decades ago. After years of formal training in music, including several degrees in music composition, I must confess that I never had one interest in traditional music of Nigeria. After all, I was exposed to a wealth of amazing Western music from J.S. Bach to Charles Ives and beyond. Not necessarily a bad thing, but I was entirely focused on being consummate in the craft of Western European-style composition. I can't tell you what changed in me. Perhaps it was composers like Steve Reich who was writing West African-influenced music and caring more about my musical heritage than me, or again, just longing for the something new in music composition. Or perhaps it was the Holy Spirit. But at some point in my mid-20s, I felt a strong desire to connect with my African heritage musically. I received a research grant that allowed me to travel to Nigeria to study West African music, specifically the music of my father's tribe. What an illuminating experience. The rhythms, the dancing, the melodies, the harmonies, the poetic each in text. I walked away from that 3-week experience with hours of video footage, recorded songs, melodies that I attempted to transcribe on the spot, and pages of notes explaining different types and purposes for each drum, dance, and song. I mean, I felt like I like hit the lottery. All this wealth of music that I was just, my heritage that I was finally being exposed to. Professionally and scholarly, the experience was truly rewarding and rich. But what was most special about this trip, which I believe had to do a lot with my desire and my immediate relationship to the music, was how much closer and connected I became to my father, my family, and the Ishan tribe of Nigeria. Growing up, I was always proud to say I was Nigerian, but as a result of this intense ethnomusicological study, I truly felt Nigerian. So one of the results of this field research was a composition for wind band titled This is Africa. In this piece, I featured different types of African drumming and rhythms. And the work is based on this little Ishan song I discovered in Nigeria. Ekinelele yedo, ekinelele yedo, ekinelele yedo, ekinelele yedo. Obi melodika nalo ekinelele do. As you can tell, you probably understand why I'm a composer after having sung that. But I wanted to sing for you that piece. In this composition, I had members of the band chant the Ishan text at different points, and throughout the work, you will hear variations of the tune that I just attempted to perform. I will play 2 excerpts from This is Africa. The recording I will use is a live recording by the Boise State University Symphonic Winds. The addition of West African drumming made the piece cross-cultural. The amalgamation of my compositional voice with Nigerian melodic and harmonic landscapes added a unique sound. Incorporating a tune associated with a clear text and chanting that text provided meaning to the composition. Simply put, this work said something. It was more than just notes. The infusion of musical languages, both my classical languages and the language of my musical heritage, has only made the piece stronger. Lastly, if a composition can bring together those from different cultural backgrounds, capitalizing on one of the greatest advantages of art, the power to help one see life from another perspective, I believe that adds another layer of depth to that work. So I'll close with the story about how this piece, This is Africa, came about. As I mentioned before, the recording you heard was the Boise State University Symphonic Winds. This piece was commissioned by the Boise State University Symphonic Winds in honor of Dr. Harry Bejan, who was a noted music educator, having taught at the University of Illinois for many years. The only parameter I had with this commission was duration. So it was my aim to create a unique work that can honor Dr. Bejan. So I remembered that little Ishan song I came across during my research in Nigeria. That simple song, the song's simple text, as you heard me sing, and you heard chanted in the recording, is Ekine Lele Yedo Obin Men La Doi Kinalo, which is a harvest song that translates to, my investment in you has paid off. Because of your hard work, your future is bright, and others will benefit. The Ishan language is very poetic, often dialoguing in parables. Metaphorically, the song is actually talking about education. A mentor, proud of the investment she has made in her student, an investment that will benefit many students as the student goes out into the world to teach others. As such, the Ishan song was the perfect foundation for this composition. Dr. Bijan, a distinguished music educator, invested in so many students who went on to do the same thing with their own students, including, coincidentally, my own teacher and mentor, James Kerno, who I credit with having taught me the most in music composition. So who would have ever thought that the small tribe in southern Nigeria would have a little song that would be most fitting to honor one of the finest music educators in the US? Moreover, I'm sure no one in the Boise State University Symphonic Band would have ever thought they would be chanting an Ishan text. I mean, what's Ishan? After all, many of the musicians, they grew up in rural towns in Idaho. The whole experience was very special. The students enjoyed the work and they appreciated getting to know more about West African culture and music. That is what music should be about. The seamless connection between a small tribe in Nigeria and college students in Idaho. So, in a way, cultural diversity has also strengthened my classical compositions. To put it differently, it was research that connected me to my roots, enlivening my music, adding deeper meaning. My professional career, almost entirely in Western classical music, has widened the reach of my music, even bringing me to a group of students in Idaho that are as far from my roots as imaginable. This contrasting connection created an environment for real cultural sharing. It reflected, in part, the reality of the kingdom of God. Now, I just have to say, more edifying than this is the experience I have to teach here at Wheaton College, where my faith, research, and creativity can provide connections to our students through which they can deepen their faith and through art learn from and widely reach different cultures throughout the whole world. Thank you for allowing me to share some of my musical journey with you.